Hello, my name is Sarah Farkas. I'm the Associate Curator of Art here at the Crocker Art Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Arts, Letters, and Power, Van Dyck and the Portrait Print. Anthony Van Dyck is perhaps known as one of the best portrait artists of the 17th century, and this exhibition brings together over 60 works from his print series called The Iconography. This exhibition was made possible by an incredibly generous gift by Margaret and Timothy Brown, who gave the Crocker Art Museum 188 prints from this series. We're incredibly grateful for this gift because it really allows us to explore this important moment in European art history through this single artist. Anthony Van Dyck, as I said, is best known as a portrait painter, but he's also well known as the court artist to Charles I of England, the king who was famously beheaded during the English Civil Wars. It was there that his style really became synonymous with his ability to innovate new poses and to replicate the incredible fabrics and textures and jewelry of the period that was so sought after by Europe's elite. We believe that it's sometime in the 1620s or 30s that Van Dyck first comes up with the idea for the Iconography series, as it later comes to be known, which is a print portrait series that brings together some of the most famous artists, thinkers, military leaders, and nobility of the period. These prints were highly collectible, highly portable, and really would have been sought after by collectors who were looking to cultivate their own curated collection of portrait prints by this incredible artist. I'd like to begin by looking at this image here, which is the frontispiece for the earliest known edition of the Iconography series, published in 1645. So this is the cover image, or the title page image for that first printing. And what you see here is a bust of Anthony Van Dyck, and this head here is an etching that was done by Van Dyck himself. For this series, Van Dyck collaborated with a number of engravers, but he also etched the first 15 portraits on his own. And that starts here with just the top part, his head, that's been etched by Van Dyck. The rest of this image was filled in by another engraver, Jacob Niepce, who has turned that self-portrait head into this classical bust that is turned to face us, and then is inscribed with the information about the series that this frontispiece begins. And what this does is really create a declaration about Van Dyck and who he is in this moment. The 17th century was a real turning point in the status of the artist. In earlier periods in European history, artists had generally been considered more like craftspeople who would create final products, but were not necessarily the generators of ideas themselves. They were working with ideas that were being generated both by their patrons or by the Catholic Church, for instance, but they were not necessarily considered thinkers or producers of ideas themselves. By this point, however, that has started to change. Really in the late 15th century and into the 16th century, artists are starting to make a claim for themselves as part of the thinking creative class. And so by displaying Van Dyck here as a bust, as this classical bust, it's really a claim to his status and his importance as a creator in his society. One of the things that makes Anthony Van Dyck's series so unique for this time period is the inclusion of many of the artists that were in his professional network at this time. In the 17th century, artists weren't necessarily thought of as worthy of being portrayed in a portrait series. It was common to have series of famous individuals like professors, military leaders, rulers of different states, but artists were not necessarily considered necessary to portray in portraiture. But Anthony Van Dyck really wants to elevate the status of his craft by including the many other artists who are operating in this period that he's coming into contact with. This wall here celebrates the way artists were trained in this period. Many artists learned at the knee of a father or an uncle who was an artist, or someone else in their family that had trained in this craft. Here, for instance, we see the portraits of Jan Bruegel the Elder and Peter Bruegel the Younger, two sons of Peter Bruegel the Elder, the very well-known and incredibly established Flemish artist of the 16th century. Jan and Peter were both young children when their father died, so it was not their father who taught them how to paint, but it is thought that actually their first artistic education came through their grandmother, Maken Verhulst, who was married to Peter Coco van Elst, who was also an incredibly important artist in this family network. And Maken Verhulst herself was not just a contributor to her husband's studio and workshop, but also a watercolorist herself. And it is thought that she taught the young Bruegel boys after their father had died. This part of the exhibition is organized like a kind of family tree, celebrating Van Dyck's professional network and the many artists operating in Northern Europe that he was coming into contact with. Some of those were through his teacher, Peter Paul Rubens, whose portrait is situated right up here. Peter Paul Rubens, of course, was the titan of 17th century Baroque painting. And when Van Dyck was training in Rubens's studio, Rubens even called Van Dyck his best pupil. So high praise indeed. If we zoom in for a moment on Van Dyck's portrait, we can see how Van Dyck is trying to communicate his status, and he really did attain an incredible status for an artist in this time period. We see again that self-portrait that he had etched that's in the frontispiece on the other side of the exhibition, but here it is now a full-bodied portrait instead of that bust. And this is actually based on a painted self-portrait by Van Dyck that's in the Uffizi in Florence, Italy, that he painted around 1632. And what he's done that's incredibly unusual here is he's turned his body and his full shoulder against us. This is really an unusual body position for a portrait in this time period. But what it does is it shows off this incredible chain that is coming down Van Dyck's back. And this chain was a gift to Van Dyck from King Charles I of England on the occasion of his knighthood. So we know that Van Dyck, in addition to being the court painter to the King of England, was also knighted by him, achieving a really high status for an artist in this period. If we zoom out to the rest of the wall, we can see the relationships that all of these artists have to each other in this period. So not only is Van Dyck placed under his teacher, Peter Paul Rubens, but if we look up here, we see Adam van Noort, who was Rubens's teacher, but also the teacher to Jacob Jordaens, another well-regarded artist of this period, and Sebastian Franks over here. If we turn to the other side, we see many of the artists that collaborated with Rubens and Van Dyck on printing projects. So for instance, Willem Hondius right here is reproduced in this portrait print, and you can actually see that he engraved his own portrait. So it says his name and that it was engraved by him after a painting by Van Dyck. So he would have collaborated with Van Dyck to create his own portrait for this series. This person right here, Lucas Vosterman, was both a collaborator with Van Dyck and Peter Paul Rubens. In fact, he worked in Rubens's studio. And we think that it is Rubens's studio where Van Dyck probably came up with the idea for the iconography series for the first time because of relationships like the one between Vosterman and Rubens. Rubens was an incredible, canny businessman in addition to being an artist. And he understood that he could increase his own fame and his own success by reproducing his paintings through prints. So in 1619, he actually secures the right to copyright his designs so that he can hire engravers like Vosterman to reproduce his paintings in these prints that can then be reproduced several hundred times and shipped out across Europe and really increase his fame and increase, his access to new patrons for his painting. So this could be one reason why Van Dyck embarks on the iconography series, because he wants to increase his own fame and his own access to patrons in the same way that Rubens did, by getting his portraiture out there so that the wealthy patrons of different European countries might seek him out for portraits. Now, the funny thing about the relationship between Fosterman and Rubens is that at some point it went sour. We don't exactly know what happened, but the thought is that it was a dispute over this right to copyright the designs. And what we do know is that at some point Rubens actually takes out a restraining order against Fosterman, possibly because of a physical fight that ensued between the two of them over this dispute on copyright. In addition to the many painters and engravers that Anthony Van Dyck chose to include in the iconography series, he also brought in portraits of artists who work in other media. So for instance, artists who were sculptors, musicians, silver and metalsmiths, and also architects. This is a portrait of Inigo Jones, who is one of the most important architects of the 17th century and is best known for his redesign of the layout of the Covent Garden district in London. And here, just as in Anthony Van Dyck's portrait, we really see Van Dyck's facility with new poses and gestures that give you a sense of the life of the sitter behind the portrait. So here we see Jones with a somewhat rumpled costume. He's staring off into the distance, perhaps thinking about his next design. And quite cleverly, he's also holding this piece of drafting paper that's somewhat dangling from his fingers and comes out beyond the frame. It even casts a shadow across the inscription that lists his name. And it just gives you the sense of a figure who's really believably existing in a three-dimensional space, and maybe could even potentially reach out beyond the frame to have a conversation with us. This exhibition also explores the different printing techniques that were used in Van Dyck's series. So here we see two prints of the same artist, Jan Snellink. And this one here on the right was done with a technique called engraving, whereas this one here on the left was done by a technique called etching. Both of these printing techniques start with a metal plate, usually copper in Van Dyck's case. And with the engraving, the engraver would have taken a metal tool called a burin, which is a small pointed tool, and actually carved this portrait into that metal plate. Once here she was finished with the engraving, the plate would have been inked and then run through a printing press to create the image that you see here. The etching, however, would have taken that same kind of plate, and instead of directly carving into the metal, the etcher would have coated it with a acid-resistant substance, this kind of waxy coating, and then taken another tool and actually sort of drawn this image into that waxy substance, revealing a little bit of the metal below with each of those strokes. Then the plate would have been submerged in an acid bath, and only those parts of the metal plate that were exposed through that drawing process would have been etched with the acid, and then everything that was covered in that waxy substance still would remain unscathed. Then the wax would be removed and the plate would be inked again, just like in the engraving process, and run through the printing press to create the image that you see here. In both cases, there's a limited number of impressions that can be made from a single plate, usually only 200 or 300. So it was not possible to infinitely reproduce these images, but certainly it was enough that you could create quite a few impressions that would have then been able to be circulated quite widely in order to help increase Van Dyck's fame and the reach of this series. And what you can see here between these two processes, I think very clearly demonstrates why someone might want to collect portraits done in both different techniques. The engraving, for instance, has these sort of much finer, detailed lines where you get a much livelier line in the etching, and really a different character through these different techniques. Now that we've looked at some of the many artists that Van Dyck included in the iconography series, I'd like to turn to a different type of sitter, the so-called men of letters. That is, the thinkers, philosophers, and writers who were active during Van Dyck's time, and some of them quite a bit earlier. This first portrait is of Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a humanist philosopher working in Europe about 100 years before Van Dyck created this series. He probably based it on an earlier portrait made about 1530 by Hans Holbein the Younger, which Van Dyck might have seen in Italy when he was traveling with his teacher, Peter Paul Rubens. If we look in at this portrait, we can see that Van Dyck has used a very unusual technique. It is not the polished, refined surface that we see in some of these other portrait prints, but rather quite unfinished looking, but it is entirely intentional. Van Dyck wanted to experiment with different ways of portraying his portraits in print. And in this one, he's done some incredible detail and modeling in Erasmus's face, but as you get further into the portrait, some of that detail starts to disappear, and he's really experimented with these different little bits of stippling, these little dots and lines that make up his costume and really give it a much more sort of immediate and spontaneous character than the more polished prints that you see elsewhere in the exhibition. Unlike the portrait of Erasmus, this is a very finished portrait. Here we see Theodore van Tolden, who was one of the most important legal minds of the 17th century, and he's done completely differently than Erasmus. Here, Van Dyck and his collaborator, Peter de Jode the Younger, have completely finished the background. We have some elaborate drapery and a very stately column that sort of complete this scene. But he's also placed Van Tolden in a somewhat unusual, very frontal, stated portrait. We see him gesturing very emphatically into the book that he has open, and it really gives Van Tolden this sense of absolute authority, which really relates to Van Tolden's place in society as a legal scholar. Van Tolden was one of the first legal scholars of the idea of public law, which is about the relationship between the individual and the state. And you get the sense that he is, absolutely confident in his legal opinions through the gesture that he's communicating in his portrait. One of the interesting things about this portrait is that the preparatory drawing for it still survives. It's held by the Louvre in France. And in that version of the portrait, we actually can see that the book that he is gesturing at is one by the ancient Roman philosopher Boethius, who was one of the foundational scholars for the ideas about happiness and natural rights. And Van Tolden really carries on those ideas in his philosophical writings of the 17th century, exploring the ideas that there are a basic set of natural or human rights that every individual is endowed with. Anthony Van Dyck also included a number of important art collectors in this series. Up here we see Nicholas Rocox, who was one of the most important collectors in Antwerp at this time. He was also a humanist thinker and at one point the mayor of Antwerp, which we can even see sort of peeking out behind a billowing fabric that has blown open in the wind. Rocox here is seated in a kind of domestic space, but still very much gives us a sense of his authority. He's seated in a very fine chair and he's dressed in his finest clothes. But very interestingly, his hand is resting on a table that includes many objects that reference his love of art. We have several busts here and some books. In other versions of this portrait that exist, sometimes there are coins on the table. He was an incredible collector of portrait medals, which was another way of creating portraits that could be shared and very easily ported around, just like portrait prints. His portrait here is situated above another art lover, Cornelius van der Geest, and in this one you even see in his inscription, it simply titles him Art Lover of Antwerp. As we move further through the exhibition, we come across more portraits of wealthy and elite powerful individuals. These two portraits here were after painted portraits that were done for weddings. This one here is of Marie de Rade, who was only 16 when she married the wealthy scion of a gunpowder manufacturing family. But you can see here that no expense was spared in preparing her for her new role as the wife of a wealthy and powerful merchant. She has beautiful layers of Flemish lace in her costume, incredible ribbons that are tying up these billowing sleeves. It's been an incredible and expensive amount of fabric to manufacture this gown. She has got layer upon layer of pearls. You can count, several rows of pearls on each hand, as well as additional strands around her neck and draped throughout her costume. And then, of course, she's carrying an ostrich feather fan, which would have been an imported bird feather and incredibly rare and precious as well. And this really shows why Van Dyck was such a sought-after portraitist for Europe's elite. He was incredibly skilled at reproducing costume, which was the main way that one could show off their power in their portrait. It really says, look at what I have accomplished, that I can afford all of these expensive and different luxury items. This wall of the exhibition, I sometimes somewhat tongue-in-cheekly refer to as our wall of traitors. And naturally, it is positioned very far away from the war heroes from the 30 Years' War that we'll see later in the exhibition. But all three of these individuals were involved in the political intrigues of the English court during the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. Several of them acted as spies and go-betweens for different sides in that conflict. This woman, for instance, Catherine Howard, who's not to be confused with the 16th century Catherine Howard, who was Queen of England and the wife of Henry VIII. This Catherine Howard was an English noblewoman who did act as a spy during this period, and she passed notes for King Charles in order to help him and his supporters. Unfortunately, she was captured by the parliamentarians, the folks that were supporting people like Oliver Cromwell during the Civil Wars, and she was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Luckily, she was wealthy enough and well-connected enough that she was able to escape execution and actually escape her imprisonment, but her and her husband both had to flee England and live in the Netherlands after this period. As we move through this section of powerful people in the exhibition, we'll come across more individuals who were quite scandalous in their behavior. And it really speaks to one of the purposes or one of the reasons that the iconography series was so attractive to collectors is they told interesting stories. And we can imagine that many collectors would have taken real delight in the process of assembling their collection and picking out individuals that were the most interesting to them, including people who led somewhat infamous lives, like this woman here, Beatrice de Cousance. Beatrice developed a reputation for scandal at a very young age when she fell in love with Charles IV of Lorraine. And she fell absolutely head over heels with him, was ready to run away with him. But unfortunately, Charles was already married. So her parents made sure that she was married off incredibly quickly to try to avoid this kind of family scandal. But her first husband died quite suddenly, only 2 years into their marriage. And 9 days after his death, Beatrice ran off with Charles, and they went and got married. But Charles was still married to his first wife, Nicolette. But the two were so inseparable that they wouldn't give each other up, and even Charles was excommunicated by Pope Urban VIII, but really refused to give up his relationship with Beatrice. Charles's first wife, Nicolette, actually sued them several times in court and really defied the legitimacy of this second marriage. But it really speaks to the nature of the iconography series as a conversation piece that someone like Beatrice is included. You can imagine that a collector would have enjoyed being able to share this story with his visitors or his friends or his or her visitors and friends, as well as admired the beauty of the portrait itself. Now, of course, not all of the individuals included in the iconography series were included because they were scandalous. Some of them are included because they were virtuous, moral individuals. And you can imagine that another reason that it would have been popular to collect these portraits was because looking on the portrait of someone that you admired and that you wanted to emulate might help you instill those virtues in yourself. Several of the portraits included in this exhibition are portraits of military commanders from the 30 Years' War, which is one of the most extensive military conflicts and violent military conflicts of the 17th century. It spread all across Europe, but was essentially a product of tension that had been brewing between Catholics and Protestants for quite a long time at this point, really from the early 1500s when the Protestant Reformation began. This portrait here is of Jean de Cercles, the Count of Tilly, and he was an incredibly successful military commander, and he was involved in several different conflicts in the German states during the 30 Years' War, but quite famously was involved in the siege of Magdeburg, which was one of the most destructive sieges of civilian life during this conflict. And you can see that, not only is he portrayed quite nobly in his armor, and he actually holds a baton, which symbolizes his authority in this portrait, but he's also placed in front of a broken wall with flames coming up from behind it. And this refers to the end of that siege when the city of Magdeburg, a Protestant city, was set ablaze in 1631. And it's estimated that this killed somewhere around 20,000 civilians. Like the portrait of the Count of Tilly with its flames of the siege of Magdeburg behind it, several other portraits hint at the cost of war as well as portray the individuals who were involved in the 30 Years' War and its other conflicts. Both Antonio de Tassis and Christian, the Duke of Brunswick and Lüneburg, lost limbs or partial limbs while fighting in battle, but they deal with that completely differently in their portraits. Antonio de Tassis is shown here holding a book in his hand. This is probably created well after he retired from his military career, where he had embarked on a life of religious study, so we can assume this is probably a religious text. And his missing limb is almost entirely concealed by his cloak that has gone over his shoulder. And this would have been a very common way to deal with these kinds of injuries or physical differences during this time period. It was very common that portraiture was meant to show a very idealized self, and that was expected of one's portrait at this time. Although somewhat interestingly, Christian, Duke of Brunswick and Lüneburg, deals with this entirely differently. His arm is front and center in this absolutely elaborate and fabulously decorated sling. It's trimmed with lace. It's got delicate embroidery all over it, and you can really tell that he is showing off what he had to give up in order to accomplish his successful military career. This is very in keeping with what we know about his character as an individual. Apparently his nickname was the Mad Christian because of the ferocity of his fighting on the battlefield. And it is said that after he lost his limb, he actually issued commemorative medals that said his new motto was, "I've still got the other one." So definitely someone who was very proud of his military accomplishments and somewhat playful with the cost that he endured in order to accomplish them. And it really goes to show again sort of Van Dyck's interest in suggesting something about the character of his individuals in their portraits. Christian, the Mad Christian, is very proudly showing off his military accomplishment, while Antonio de Tassis is showing us his interest in a life of religious contemplation after war. Before we wrap up, I want to highlight one of the treasures from our drawing collection that is also included here in this exhibition. Although most of the works featured in this show come from the gift from Margaret and Timothy Brown, some of the drawings here come from earlier parts of our collection. For instance, this portrait of Paulus van Hamala, one of the senators of Antwerp. This portrait was actually collected by the Crocker family in the 19th century. century, and we're incredibly lucky to have it because it is one of the few surviving preparatory drawings for a portrait in the iconography series. And here we have it right next to the printed portrait here, the final product that would have come from this preparatory drawing. And what's interesting about having these two works side by side is it really allows you to see part of Van Dyck's process and what is established through the different steps in the design. So this drawing really shows how Van Dyck is concentrating on the face and the details of the sitter's countenance in this first preparatory drawing. From here, he would have taken this and then created an oil sketch that was much more detailed and really figured out some of these passages in his costume, what his hands are doing, and finished the rest of the design. And that's actually reproduced on the label on the side of this case. And then that design would have been used by the engraver that Van Dyck collaborated with in order to create the finished print that you see here. And with that, I'd like to conclude this curator talk and really encourage you to come see this exhibition before it closes on October 12th. There's a lot more to see here than what I've covered today, but really what I want to emphasize is not just the incredible stories that are included in this exhibition, but also the windows into the different techniques that artists are using in this period, both for drawing and for creating such fantastic prints. We hope to see you here soon.